Okay, well, welcome everybody. Welcome to the 18th Stephen Roskill Memorial Lecture, the latest in a biennial series which started under my predecessor, Corelli Barnett, in 1985. Thank you all so much for coming, especially so many members of the Roskill family. I'm also delighted that in Randolph Churchill, we have the great-grandson of one of the major actors at the Yalta conference. My name's Alan. I'm lucky enough to be the director of the Churchill Archive Centre, and as such, I'm acting as Master of Ceremonies this evening, which means that I have to start with the obligatory housekeeping notices. As you probably saw when you came in, we are filming tonight's proceedings, so if you don't want to be filmed, please don't ask a question. We're not anticipating any fire alarms, though that said, there has been a lot of building work going on within this area. In the event that the alarms do sound, follow the directions of the team members out of the fire exits to the assembly point outside. Please put your phones to silent, but not necessarily to off, because for those of you who do like to tweet, we are encouraging you to do so, and we have the hashtag Roskill20, as in Roskill 2020, for you to use. Our subject tonight starts really with the origins of the Cold War in 1945, but I hope it's not too cold for you this evening. Some of you will know that we're in the middle of replacing the heating in this theatre, and I have to thank Tom Bowden, Michael Doyle, and the maintenance team for working round the clock today to get some heating into this area. I'm sure our discussions will soon warm the place up, and if that doesn't work, there's a drinks reception afterwards in the buttery to which you are all invited. Now, in January 1945, Winston Churchill sent a telegram to President Franklin Roosevelt, and it read, "No more let us falter, from Malta to Yalta, let nobody alter." And I think that gives us our direction of travel this evening. To launch us on our way, and to introduce our speaker, can I call upon Dr. Adrian Crisp. Adrian was Associate Dean in the University of Cambridge School of Clinical Medicine from 1998 to 2005. He was Director of Studies in Clinical Medicine here at Churchill College from 1992 to 2011, and he's been a Fellow of this college since 1993. More importantly for tonight, he is the long-standing and extremely supportive chair of our College Archives Committee, and a passionate advocate of this lecture and this speaker. Adrian.
Thank you. It's an enormous pleasure to introduce Professor David Reynolds, our Roskill Lecturer for 2020. David is Emeritus Professor of International History in this university and needs little introduction to enthusiasts of the history of the 20th century. For those who remain to be converted, David not only revels in the fine technical detail of history, but also makes it easily accessible to those who are not professional historians. He is a Fellow of Christ's College and of the British Academy. David has also been a staunch member of the Churchill Archives Committee here at Churchill College for 19 years. He is the author of 12 books and editor of 5. It is a challenging task to choose the most important, but my own high 5 include In Command of History. This is his masterpiece and was awarded the Woolston Prize in 2004. It reveals how Churchill not only roared for Britain, but wrote for Britain before, during, and after the Second World War. America, Empire of Liberty is the best one-volume history of the USA and was the basis of a BBC radio series. The Long Shadow on the legacies of the First World War also triggered a 3-part BBC television documentary, and David has written and presented no fewer than 13 BBC documentaries, achieving his objective of wider access to history. More recently, The Kremlin Letters, Stalin's wartime correspondence with Churchill and Roosevelt. For this, he collaborated with his Russian colleague and former Churchill Archives by-fellow, Vladimir Pechatnov. His most recent book, Island Stories, Britain and its History in the Age of Brexit, brings us right up to the febrile history of the present day. Today, David is going to speak on Yalta at 75, the summit and its legacies from 1945 to 2020. Let us welcome David Reynolds, this year's Roskill lecturer.
Thank you, Adrian. Well, thank you, Adrian, for your kind words. It's a great honour to deliver the Roskill lecture. I think I was here at the first one when Lord Carrington spoke. It's a particular pleasure to have in the audience two former Roskill lecturers, Bridget Kendall and Sir Roderick Lyne. I also had the pleasure, if I may address the Roskill family, of meeting Stephen Roskill when he lived in Frostlake Cottage in Malting Lane. I was a young and probably too earnest graduate student, but he was very kind to me and very thoughtful, and I've since appreciated how much his work has done to create these archives here. It's also more generally a pleasure to be at Churchill College. As Adrian said, I've been a member of the Archives Committee for nearly 20 years now, and I've come to greatly respect and have real affection for this college. Of course, I'm devoted to my own college, Christ, but I think I would regard Churchill as my, how shall we say, home from home. So, on to the subject. 75 years on from February 1945, Yalta remains a dirty word. Not as tainted as Munich, now lodged in the English language as a synonym for surrender, but certainly not a kind of finest hour moment of which to be proud. In Gaullist France, and even in France today, the conference has been depicted as the week when the superpowers divided Europe into two blocks. In Cold War America, the Republican right damned President Franklin Roosevelt for consigning millions of human beings to communist oppression. Even in 2005, the 60th anniversary, President George W. Bush declared that Yalta, quote, will be remembered as one of the greatest wrongs in history. This evening, in the time available, I want to explore three main themes. First, Yalta did not divide the continent. That was already happening on the battlefield and not at the conference table. Second, what's interesting and I think still instructive about Yalta is the conference as an approach to diplomacy. How to try and deal with a regime you dislike but have to live with. And that's as much a challenge in the era of Vladimir Putin and Ayatollah Khomeini as it was in the days of Joseph Stalin. I'll say a little about the big three in the light of what we now know from the archives. But as we look back from 2020 with, you might say, the 2020 vision of hindsight, let's not forget the obvious. The obvious but easily forgotten point that this vision was not vouchsafed to them. As the distinguished Cambridge medieval historian F.W. Maitland observed, we must remember that events now long in the past were once in the future. Sounds banal, but it's actually a fundamental point for historians as they think about the past. And with that in mind, that, if you like, third point about the past, remembering that events now long in the past were once in the future, I hope this lecture will shed an unfamiliar light on our greatest war leader, on his thinking and his feelings, on his achievements and even his regrets. And along the way, I hope we will have a little bit of fun as well. Okay, so did Yalta divide the continent? No. The partition of Europe had already happened to a significant extent on the battleground. You don't have to be able to see all the colours to basically understand that the coloured areas of that map show us how the Red Army moved from the beginning of August 1943, that's after the great tank battle at Kursk, to the end of December 1944, in other words, the eve of Yalta. Moving at a remarkable pace at times, particularly in June 1944, into Byelorussia, much of Poland, sweeping down into Romania, Bulgaria, and on into a large part of Hungary. That area is under Soviet control by the time the conference starts. That's a given. Those are facts on the ground. The question is what to do with them, what to do with that. Roosevelt and Churchill were great believers in personal diplomacy. Here they are. They met as a big three twice at Tehran in the end of November 43 and in Yalta in February 1945. Churchill also paid two other visits to Moscow. In August 1942, there he is with Stalin, and in October 44, that is the famous, shall we say, notorious percentages agreement he drew up, assigning or suggesting spheres of influence in different parts of southeastern Europe. So Romania, 90% Russian, the others 10%. Greece, 90% British, others 10%. Yugoslavia, 50-50 split. Quite exactly what Churchill meant by that is not clear, but it's something I'll come back to in a little later. And it shows his determination to try and deal with the fact of the Soviet presence on the ground. So Churchill is in many ways the go-between between the other two. Stalin's fearful of flying and getting outside the Soviet security net. Roosevelt, of course, a paraplegic, it finds it extremely difficult to travel. And if you think of those two pictures of Tehran and Yalta, Tehran really, Roosevelt's health never recovered from that journey, and Yalta pretty much finished him off. So Churchill is the go-between, the traveller, and indeed the Cabinet War Rooms, I think, has estimated that Churchill did 107,000 air miles during the war. And that is not first class in jet aircraft, of course, that is in usually unheated bombers, unpressurized, so you put on an oxygen mask over 10,000 feet. So a considerable achievement in itself for a man around the age of 70. Indeed, when that picture of the big three was taken, it was a long photo opportunity at Tehran, and somebody said that the three of them looked like the Holy Trinity. When this was translated to Stalin, he said, if we are Holy Trinity, Churchill is the Holy Ghost because he flies around so much. Stalin, of course, had been trained in a seminary, but he also had a dry sense of humour, really quite an engaging chap for a mass murderer. So, Churchill and Roosevelt believe in personal diplomacy. Here's a quotation from Franklin Roosevelt in March 1942, writing to Churchill. I think I can personally handle Stalin better than either your Foreign Office or my State Department. Stalin hates the guts of your top people. He thinks he likes me better, and I hope he will continue to do so. Now, just for context, that is written by a man who's never met Stalin and has only exchanged half a dozen messages between them. So it's an indication of Roosevelt's enormous self-confidence. But here's a quotation from Churchill to an old friend in January 1944, soon after Tehran. If only Stalin and I could meet once a week, there would be no trouble at all. We get on like a house on fire. Two quite striking comments indicating a supreme confidence in these two leaders' power of personal diplomacy. Now, of course, Churchill had a rather more divided mind than Roosevelt. Roosevelt anticipated, I think, a gradual convergence over the 20th century of the Soviet Union and the United States. The Soviet Union throwing off the old-style revolutionary ethos and ideology and moving towards a kind of social democratic format, which was, of course, what Roosevelt envisaged from his own New Deal. So long-term convergence. Churchill was not, I think, as optimistic as that. He didn't share Roosevelt's own progressive ideology. But Churchill, of course, as an old anti-Bolshevik, a veteran anti-Bolshevik, had lingering doubts and deep fears about what the Soviet Union represented. So here's one example from October 1942, writes to the Foreign Secretary, Anthony Eden, "It would be a measureless disaster if Russian barbarism overlaid the culture and independence of the ancient states of Europe." That concern is always at the back of his mind. But here's another quotation written to Eden in message to Eden in March 43, a few months later, which I think helps to explain Churchill's attitude to this difficult, problematic leader, a man who would send messages of considerable friendliness and then blistering attacks on why there was no second front or why the Arctic convoys had been suspended. Churchill writes to Eden in March 1943, "There are two forces, I think, to be reckoned with in Russia. A, Stalin himself, personally cordial to me, and B, Stalin in council, a grim thing behind him, which we and he have to reckon with." Stalin in council, a grim thing behind him, which we and he have to reckon with. And that, I think, that notion of the two Stalins, as I call it, is, I think, one of the keys to understanding Churchill's attitude, almost his divided mind, towards the Soviet Union and to the Soviet leader. He personally could get on with Stalin. There was a personal relationship. But Stalin was beholden to dark forces in the Kremlin, which would meant that sometimes he wouldn't be able to act in the way he wanted. Now, just think about that for a moment. It's true that, for example, Sheila Fitzpatrick, the distinguished historian of the Soviet Union, has written recently and interestingly about Stalin's team, as she puts it. This was a man who ran a team of people, undoubtedly true. But as she also says, nobody in Moscow had any doubt who was boss. The idea that there were dark forces behind Stalin that he had to keep watching his backside about is, to say the least, bizarre. But it's a reminder of how opaque the Soviet Union was to people who were dealing in those days of limited information, not of 24/7 news and social media. And it's what Churchill used as a kind of working premise here to understand how he was, what to make of Stalin's more difficult and problematic messages. So, a profound belief in personal diplomacy, certain doubts, particularly on Churchill's part, as to how to deal with Soviet Russia, but no doubt that they had no alternative but to work with Stalin given the realities on the ground, particularly by the end of 1944. So here we are. Here's from Malta to Yalta, as Alan said. We're not Alta or Palta. Roosevelt and Churchill meeting at Malta on February the 2nd, 1945. The president takes a 10-day voyage to get there. And then flying on from Malta to Saki on the west coast of the Crimea. There they are, Roosevelt in the Jeep, because of course he's not able to move unaided, Churchill with him. And after they get there, then there's another 4 hours drive over the mountains and down to the relatively balmy southern coast of the Crimea to Yalta. This is a long journey, a difficult journey for both of them, and it's indicative of their feeling they have to meet Stalin. They have to talk with him face to face. The meeting takes place in the Livadia Palace. It's an old Tsarist resort on the coast. And it's not easy for the Russians to organize. There's a picture of some of the work going on beforehand. This had been occupied by the Germans until relatively recently. There were many signs of that Roosevelt and Churchill could see on the road over to Yalta. Kitting the place out was an enormous challenge. Hotels in Moscow were ransacked for beds, for furnishings and so on, and shipped down there. There were enormous problems with bed bugs. The Americans in particular sprayed everything with DDT in an effort unavailing to have a more comfortable night. And the plumbing was completely incorrigible. There simply weren't enough bathrooms. Many of them didn't work. And you had this bizarre sight of five-star generals queuing up like ordinary soldiers to get a wash and a shave in the morning. So this was not luxury, but it was where the meeting took place. Stalin would not travel beyond the Soviet security net. He would not accept the alternative venues suggested of a place in the Mediterranean. They needed him more than he needed them. He was controlling the strings to some extent, and so they went to him. Here's a picture now of the conference room set out to give some flavour of the meeting. And here's a view of the conference at the time. You can see here Roosevelt. You can see Stalin over here. Churchill, back of his head there. So you can see it's rather cramped, it's rather difficult, but that's where many of the plenary sessions took place. This is where they discussed the issues of war and peace. Now, I say they discussed the issues of war and peace. Well, and if you read many books on Yalta, you will have sentences like, Stalin said this, Roosevelt replied, Churchill interjected. But of course, it didn't happen like that. There was the issue of language. And they didn't deal with the issue of language in the way that would happen in modern conferences through simultaneous translation, which meant that, you can hear the words, have them translated, and see the body language at the same time. And body language in these kind of meetings is incredibly important. This was consecutive translation. And in order to explain that, we're going to take a little bit of a break and have a little bit of fun and give you a little bit of a flavour of how ponderous it was to do a conference by consecutive translation. And I have, fortunately, a few willing volunteers, and perhaps they would like to come up to the stage now. Playing the part of the Prime Minister is Churchill College's Mr. Churchill, the inevitable Alan Packwood. As you know, in theatre these days, casting is very eclectic. You have a female Macbeth, you have a whatever. So we have a female Stalin. Dr. Olga Kucharenko was a Archives By-Fellow last autumn here at the centre. She has written 2 books on Soviet Union during the war, working on her third, and she was also the invaluable assistant editor of the Kremlin letters, which Adrian mentioned earlier on. Playing the part of the President of the United States is a local president, Professor Andrew Preston. I say local president because Andrew is about to become president of the Society for Historians of American Foreign Relations, so a very considerable accolade for a non-American, not resident of the United States either. And playing the 2 parts in one of the interpreter is Barbara Loughlin, who is a translator and an interpreter, a Russianist, who's also done a great deal of work here at the archives on the Mitrokin papers, another treasure of the archives. And she will, whereas, of course, in the conference itself, Churchill would have had a translator, British, who would translate from Russian into English, and Stalin would have had a translator, Pavlov, who would interpret from Russian, English into Russian. Barbara is going to do both roles for convenience and simplicity. So this is an extract taken from the second plenary session of the conference, the second day, on the 5th of February 1945. And it's, the topic is whether France should have a zone of occupation in Germany. Churchill was keen on this. Stalin was not.
We are all now agreed, are we not, on our free zones? Well, the French want a zone, and I'm in favour of granting it to them. It does not affect the Soviet zone. Will our Russian allies agree that the British and Americans get together on a zone to allot the French?
Мы достигли соглашения по 3 зонам, не так ли? Французы хотят зону, и я за то, чтобы она была им предоставлена. Это никак не затронет советскую зону. Согласятся ли наши русские союзники с тем, чтобы британцы и американцы договорились о той части, которая будет выделена французам?
Я думаю, что в нашей работе могут возникнуть затруднения, если у нас появится 4-й член. И я предлагаю другой способ. Почему бы англичанам не привлечь Францию, Бельгию, Голландию к решению вопросов по оккупации без предоставления им права участия в контрольном механизме? Тогда мы тоже могли пригласить другие государства и таким образом облегчить бремя оккупации, но без права участия в контрольном механизме.
I think there might be complications in our work if we have a 4th member. I suggest another method for the British to get the help of France or Holland or Belgium in occupation, but not to give them rights in the control machinery. We might ask on our side to invite other states to help occupy our zone, but not to sit in on control machinery.
The discussion is on the immediate question of France. They have had long experience in occupying Germany. They do it very well and would not be lenient. We want to see their might grow to help keep Germany down. I do not know how long the United States will remain with us in occupation.
Хотелось бы обсудить непосредственно вопрос Франции. У них был большой опыт оккупации Германии. Делают это они хорошо и не будут снисходительными. Мы хотим, чтобы их мощь росла, дабы помочь приструнить Германию. Я не знаю, как долго США собираются оккупировать с нами Германию.
Интересно бы узнать мнение президента.
I should like to know the president's opinion.
I can get the people in Congress to cooperate fully for peace, but not to keep an army in Europe. 2 years would be the limit.
Thank you very much, and we'll let you know when the show transfers to the West End. But 2 important points there. First, you get a sense of the slowness, the ponderousness of consecutive translation. And believe me, those are brief extracts that we had there, brief moments from one leader or another. Churchill and Roosevelt in particular were, how shall I say, very loquacious. They liked the sound of their own voice. So it was a nightmare for an interpreter. The second thing, of course, is the president's punchline. American troops will not stay in Europe for more than a year or 2. No NATO. NATO is an inconceivable idea in 1945, an American guarantee of European security, American presence in Europe. That, if you like, is the premise of the Yalta Conference. We have to remember that events now long in the past were once in the future. Okay, so Roosevelt and Churchill go to Yalta. They are not overly optimistic. Here's what Roosevelt told senators before he left Washington. The Russians have the power in Eastern Europe. It's obviously impossible to have a break with them. Therefore, the only practicable course is to use what influence we have to ameliorate the situation. To ameliorate the situation, make it better, not change it. That, I think, is the attitude with which they go to Yalta. Now, it's 8 days of summitry, innumerable meetings. I somehow thought that you wouldn't really want to hear all about that. So I'm going to summarize this, and I'm going to summarize the meetings in a really rather irreverent way. So if you are, as it were, a practitioner of diplomacy, just close your eyes and ears at this point. But I will try and give you a brief flavor of what happens and what the outcomes are. Poland. Roosevelt and Churchill want a new Polish cabinet with non-communists from Poland and London involved, to prepare the way for full and free elections monitored by their ambassadors. What they get is that the Lublin government, that's Stalin's communist clients, will simply be, quote, reorganized on a broader democratic basis, and the US and the UK will be kept informed by their ambassadors in Moscow. Nothing there about elections and all the rest of it. The fig leaf that they get is the Declaration on Liberated Europe, which is designed by the State Department, which affirms principles of sovereign rights and self-government that should prevail in all liberated states. All three sign up to that. It's not clear what it means. So if we were, if you like, scoring this, we would say that this was, I would say, a 2-1 victory for Stalin. And often accounts of the Yalta Conference stop there with Poland. But this was a multifaceted conference. It was about thinking about the rest of the war and beginning to plan for the peace. There were other issues. And on those, there were other outcomes, different dynamics. So let's take the case of Germany. Soviets come to the Yalta Conference with very clear plans for Germany. Germany is going to be dismembered. It's going to be broken down into a number of smaller states, a kind of pre-Bismarck Germany. They have worked out a schedule of reparations totaling 20 billion, of which half will go to the Soviet Union. That's their proposal. And they do not intend to have a role for France. Churchill and his Foreign Secretary, Anthony Eden, play a very effective game here, whittling them down, whittling Stalin down. So the pledge on dismemberment in the conference protocol is vague. No figure is specified for reparations. And as you've just heard, or what will happen from that the conversation we just heard, they agree to a zone for France in occupation in Germany and a place on the Control Commission. Why does that matter? Why is the Foreign Office so keen on this? Because of the assumption that there will not be American troops in Europe for much longer. So the British want to build up France again as a potential ally against a resurgent Germany, and that is still a fear, and also possibly an unfriendly Soviet Union. So on Germany, I would say probably 3-1 to, if I was scoring it, 3-1 to Churchill. But there are other issues. They're coming to the end of the war in Europe, but the war in Asia is still going on. And again, if we think about the relationship between past and future, although Roosevelt knows that an atomic bomb will be tested in the summer, nobody knows that the atomic bomb is going to be a war-winning weapon. Nobody can be clear what it's going to do. So the American military are planning for an attack on the Japanese home islands, and they're doing it in the aftermath of Okinawa, Iwo Jima. Massive casualties are anticipated. So Roosevelt wants and he gets a firm Soviet pledge to enter the war against Japan within 3 months of victory in Europe. That is not something Stalin is unhappy to do. He's keen to do it. Stalin wants to get back Tsarist territory that now belongs to Japan and China. Roosevelt and Churchill are perfectly happy about that. They see the Soviet Union as a stabilizer in East Asia in the immediate wake of the Japanese War and civil war in China. The person who objects to that on the British side is Anthony Eden, who does not see any need to buy Russian support in a war that they want to enter anyway. But overall, one could say, East Asia is a win-win situation. Everybody's happy, to all, if you like. Roosevelt is not, in the end, that bothered about the territorial situation in Europe. What he is more interested in is the overarching structure for post-war security, a United Nations that will bring together the major powers as policemen of future security. Policeman is a word he likes to use, and in particular will bring the Soviet Union in from the cold in a way that was not the case after 1918. So what he wants is an agreement on procedures for the UN so that the founding conference, sorry for the typo, could be held on the 25th of April, a couple of months' time. Stalin objects before the conference, and the Russians dig in their heels very hard. He wants to be absolutely sure that the procedures for setting up the UN will guarantee a cast-iron Soviet veto. And he also demands seats for 16 Soviet republics. The reason he does that is because the British are padding out, as it were, their influence by bringing in all the Commonwealth countries and the Empire, and the Americans are starting to look for seats in the General Assembly for some of their Latin American clients. So this promises to be quite a big bust-up, particularly since the Soviets were extremely firm on this before the conference. But on the 7th of February, Stalin makes a big issue of conceding on these questions about the American plans for procedure, and he says he will drop the idea of the 16 republics. And it's clear that what he's doing there is it's almost a negotiating ploy to get goodwill for what matters to him particularly, which is the Soviet position on Poland. In the end, what happens is that Stalin gets seats for 2 republics, Belarus and Ukraine, and Churchill, against Roosevelt's wishes, because he can see problems with Congress, backs this to ensure that the British get 5 seats for the Commonwealth and for India as well, for the Commonwealth dominions. So the United Nations is confirmed. So what I'm trying to say very briefly here in a sort of match of the day synopsis is that there are many issues going on at the Yalta conference. It's a rounded conference like what we would expect. And the focus on Poland is not accurate in terms of the dynamics of the conference. And in fact, what matters to the participants, particularly the British and the Americans, is beyond the specific things that have been agreed, what they call the spirit of Yalta. You can see there Stalin and Churchill. Notice Stalin, even in his platform heels, is not as high as Churchill. And, you know, this is one of the more amicable pictures of the big three at Yalta. Roosevelt quite friendly and dynamic. The spirit of Yalta, the sense that there was a lot of give and take, a lot of discussion. The Russians were much more forthcoming. They didn't refer every question to Stalin. There were good military discussions as well. And this was the tone that Churchill and Roosevelt conveyed when they came back from Yalta. What's striking is the way that they chose to sell the conference and, to our eyes now, oversell it. And it's worth just going through 1 or 2 of the comments that were made. Here is Churchill to the House of Commons on the 27th of February. The impression I brought back from the Crimea is that Marshal Stalin and the Soviet leaders wish to live in honourable friendship and equality with the Western democracies. I feel also that their word is their bond. He was even bolder to a meeting of ministers on the 23rd of February. And this is worth listening to. Poor Neville Chamberlain, he said. Poor Neville Chamberlain believed he could trust Hitler. He was wrong. But I don't think I'm wrong about Stalin. That's a remarkable comment. Roosevelt is saying the same sort of things to the Congress on the 1st of May when he gives this speech, sitting down because of the, as he actually unusually frankly admits, the enormous strain of the Yalta, the journey to Yalta. And he cites Poland, the agreement on Poland, as an outstanding example, he says, of joint action by the three major Allied powers, which shows how real-world diplomacy must often be the result of give-and-take compromise. He calls Yalta a turning point in US history and, this was an ad lib, the history of the world. And he says that balance of power and spheres of influence are going to be replaced by what he calls a universal organization in which all peace-loving nations will finally have a chance to join. Now, this is real hyperbole, and you have to ask, in a way, why they are so, they go over the top on this, and, of course, create, if you like, hostages to fortune. They are both facing significant opposition at home. Churchill is afraid that a large body of Conservative MPs sympathetic to Poland are going to derail the Polish agreement. Roosevelt does not want anything to prevent the opening of the United Nations on the 25th of April. So that's part of the reason why they go in big. It's also because they've got to make the best of that fait accompli of where the Soviet Red Army is in February 1945. But it's also because of their experience of doing business with Stalin. And it's worth just stopping for a moment and trying to give you an imaginative sense of what was involved in dealing with Stalin. He was the least voluble of the three. He didn't say very much. And much of the time he would sit there and he would look down at his papers. He'd often doodle. But after a question was put to him, after it was translated, he would look up. He wouldn't look directly at you. It would be to one side or the other. He rarely made eye contact, which was slightly disconcerting. But what you got was an answer. You might not like the answer. It could be quite direct, even rude. But there was a real sense, yes, we're having a conversation in a way that simply was not true of the other, if you like, dictators of Hitler and Mussolini. So there was, if I can borrow that phrase from Margaret Thatcher about a very different Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, there was a sense you could do business with Stalin. And this was part, if you like, almost the seductive power of this man with his flashes of humor and this low-key manner. Yes, and Churchill sometimes thought this, I think, certainly in August 1942, yes, this is a mass murderer, but I kind of get on with him. And that's, of course, the seductive power of summit diplomacy. There's Roosevelt sitting and talking with Stalin. And you can see Roosevelt right on the edge of his seat as to of what Stalin was saying. So there's a hope from both of these leaders that Stalin will grasp the fact that they're not trying to turf him out of Poland, but they're saying to him, look, give us something that we can show to our publics that will say this is a more pluralist country. There's been some acknowledgement of the rights of the London Poles, some non-communist groups. Just do something almost cosmetic. And it's true that Stalin does show more flexibility than we might think, if you like, in the conventional interpretations of the Cold War. For instance, Stalin never, he always acknowledges Churchill's interest in Greece, that 90% that Churchill signed up or proposed in the percentages. And Churchill acknowledges Stalin did not break his word on Greece. It's also clear that Stalin inclines to some kind of popular front strategy in 1945-46. In other words, the feeling that actually revolution is not likely to happen across Europe and that the Soviet Union communists may have to work, at least for a time, with other non-communist parties, non-Marxist parties. It's also clear that in the summer of 1945, a number of Stalin's inner circle, Molotov, Beria, Malenkov, feel that the alliance is going to continue. Of course, manipulated for Soviet interests, but they do not want that alliance to break down in the post-war period. The problem is perhaps that for Stalin, Poland is an absolutely gut issue, which brooks no compromise. Former Tsarist territory, bitterly fought over in 1920. And of course, ultimately, Stalin doesn't do pluralism. He doesn't understand the notion of political pluralism. He doesn't understand the notion of some cosmetics democracy in the way that Churchill and Roosevelt wanted. So there are mutual misperceptions here that are underlying this, this hopefulness at Yalta. And the misperceptions and the issues come to the head fairly quickly during the course of March and April. In particular, here's a picture of the Soviet tank army moving into Poland. The Polish Committee of National Liberation is Stalin's clients, the Lublin Poles, taking control of the country. And Roosevelt and Churchill are increasingly concerned that what they had hoped would work from the Yalta Conference begins to break down. The provisional government simply vetoes candidates for its reconstruction. It excludes Western observers from the elections, and potential rivals are sent off to camps or butchered. Churchill in March and April is warning Roosevelt of a veil, a screen coming down over Eastern Europe. He wants another meeting with Stalin as a matter of urgency to try and thrash these things out. And it's interesting that Stalin is not blamed for this breakdown. Both in London and in Washington, other forces, those dark forces, are taken as being responsible. So, for example, there's a long cabinet meeting where they speculate that maybe this is the breakdown is because of the army marshals at the front, or perhaps elements of the Politburo. Again, that sense of Stalin and dark forces. So Churchill is pressing for a meeting, another summit. Roosevelt is encouraging him to not exaggerate every daily crisis. He says these crop up almost every day, and we shouldn't get, the general Soviet issue is still manageable. We shouldn't overreact. And that's the position he takes when he's back in Warm Springs, Georgia, writing his speech for the United Nations. There he is with his leg up and his leg brace on in April 1945. And then on the 12th of April, he suffers in Warm Springs a massive cerebral hemorrhage, dies. President Roosevelt is dead. Truman to continue policies. Ninth Army crosses the Elbe, nears Berlin. And at this point, I would say the alliance becomes unhinged. It's often said that in the later part of the war, Roosevelt goes cool on Churchill. He's got the measure of this old Victorian. He's much more interested in wooing Stalin. Undoubtedly, he's interested in wooing Stalin, but he takes Churchill for granted, if you like, in the literal sense. Churchill is a given. The British are going to be one of the two central policemen of the post-war era. It's just that there are other things he's going to work on. And it's very clear that many of the messages sent to Stalin are drafted by the two of them. They exchange drafts across the Atlantic. They're talking about a common approach. And there is a sense, really, if you look at that correspondence, it struck me when we were working on it, that they act as balancers for each other. There are times when Churchill is gingering Roosevelt along, pushing him to get on with it. And there are times when Roosevelt is saying, just cool it, Winston, just calm down, don't overreact. It's a kind of creative, constructive tension. And now the hinge has broken. The most graphic way, I think, to illustrate how the alliance, and in some ways Churchill is unhinged, is Operation Unthinkable. Sometime in May 1945, not long after VE Day, 8th of May, Churchill asks the military planners to work out whether it would be possible, as he puts it, to get a square deal for Poland by military means. In other words, by war. The planners take a deep breath. They draw up a scenario for an attack by 45 British and American divisions on a front close to the Baltic Sea so they can have naval and air cover. That is not enough, that troops are not enough, so one of the premises of the plan that they've been told explicitly to use as a premise is that they will also rearm German troops. So this is a week or so after victory against Germany, and you're now talking about attacking your wartime ally using troops of the defeated enemy. The planners take a very deep breath, and they tell Churchill what could be done and what the consequences would be. If our political objective is to be achieved, the defeat of Russia in a total war will be necessary, not just a limited war over Poland. The result is not possible to forecast, but to win it would take us a very long time. We must envisage a worldwide struggle. In other words, they're saying, if you want a square deal for Poland by military means, you're talking about World War III. Churchill just drops the idea dead. It's consigned to the archives as Operation Unthinkable. If you're interested in it, you just Google it afterwards. It's the National Archives have put a good deal of it up on their own website. Now, this, for me, is a document I have come back to on a number of occasions. There are some documents I think are, if you like, light bulb moments for a historian. They suddenly illuminate a whole tract of the past. This is, I call it, it's kind of itchy document. You keep scratching it. You think, what the hell is this man up to? I mean, here, Winston Churchill is a man who understands war. He understands military issues. What is he saying? Why is he saying, think of a war, contingency plan for a war with the Soviet Union? And I think of some of the evidence around this, the comments of many of his advisors, that this is a man utterly exhausted by 5 years of war leadership. It's there in Alan Brooke's diaries, Chief of the Imperial General Staff, who incidentally writes that the whole idea of Unthinkable is fantastic, meaning ludicrous fantasy. It's also there in the comments of devoted Churchill servants like Edward Bridges, the cabinet secretary. Churchill is worn out. Yes, I think that's true. But what it also tells us, I think, is just how frustrated he felt about the issue of Poland. After all, this is the issue on which ostensibly Britain had gone to war in 1939 to defend the independence of Poland. And what Churchill knows is that he's now, if he concedes this to Stalin, he is betraying hundreds of thousands of Polish troops who have fought and died with and for Britain. Poland, he said to Stalin at Yalta, is a debt of honor, and it was a debt of honor that he felt personally. So this is a really pained moment for Churchill. It's a moment, I think, when the sense of his limits of his power become clear and hurt him. And that's why I think, in part, Churchill loses his balance over Unthinkable. Not least because he's also lost his balance as well in Franklin Roosevelt. So, Churchill takes, I think, a deep breath, and he returns to the idea of talking at the conference table, trying to have it out not on the battlefield with Stalin, but on the conference table. So here he is at Potsdam, 25th of July, 1945, with the new American president, Truman, and Stalin. A photo opportunity just before he flies back to London to get the results of the British election. And that's the result. Churchill's moving out of 10 Downing Street a few days later, and of course they had nowhere to go. They had to stay in a hotel, and then with their daughter, the Sands family, vacated their own house to let them stay. So Churchill is out of office, but the strategy that he develops is articulated, I think, very clearly a year later at Fulton, Missouri, famous speech, generally known, of course, as the Iron Curtain speech, where he speaks very strongly about the no appeasement of the Soviet Union. What's needed, he says, is a special relationship to consolidate the special relationship between Britain and America that had been there in wartime, so that from a position of strength, we can reach a good understanding on all points with Russia. In other words, the special relationship is the basis for diplomacy, for meeting at the conference table. And that's why Churchill's title for the speech, as you probably know, is not the Iron Curtain, but the Sinews of Peace. Strength as the sinews of peace. And this is the motif that follows Churchill, I think, for the rest of his public life. Speech in Edinburgh in February 1950. He calls for another talk with Soviet Russia upon the highest level. He adds, "It's not easy to see how matters could be worsened by another parley at the summit." Those three words, those three phrases in red, Iron Curtain, special relationship, summit, remind us that, amongst other things, Churchill left us three words, concepts, which are still part of the diplomatic lexicon to the present day. It's not easy to write about the Cold War and the post-1945 world without using those terms. He's a wordsmith as well as a war leader. And when Churchill wins the next election, finally, in October 1951, unsuccessful in 1950, successful in 1951, it's interesting to see what he does almost immediately. He writes a message to Stalin. "Now that I am again in charge of His Majesty's government, let me reply to your farewell telegram from Potsdam. Greetings, Winston Churchill." He gets an acknowledgement from the Kremlin, and he writes to Truman saying, "We are now in touch again." 2 days later, he speaks to the House of Commons, pledging, despite all the challenges and all the difficulties which he admits, a supreme effort to bridge the gulf between the two worlds, so that each can live life, if not in friendship, at least without the fear, the hatreds, and the frightful waste of the Cold War. Never must we admit that a third world war is inevitable. And that is, of course, what Churchill tried to do in his second administration, to arrange another summit with Stalin and then later with Stalin's successors, finding increasing resistance from Eisenhower in the United States, but what in many ways kept him going. That didn't come off. 1955, he retires as Prime Minister. His family gradually persuade him to retire from active politics, from being an MP. The last years are not happy ones. There are pictures like that of Churchill sitting for hours looking at the pool at Chartwell, and one often wonders what went through his mind. In 1962, his private secretary, Anthony Montagu Brown, noted, or wrote to a colleague, "He has repeatedly said to me, I would like to die, and I wish I had died in 1945. In a way like Roosevelt at the moment of victory. Yet Churchill does not die. He fights his way back to office in 1951, in part because he wants to, as he sometimes said, stay in the pub till closing time, because life without politics and so on would be difficult to imagine. But there's more to it than that, I think. And maybe you can see from what we've been talking about this evening. Let me illustrate it with one story from August 1945. This is the 10th of August. So the atomic bombs have been dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It's clear that Japan is going to surrender. And Churchill is driven to Chartwell for the weekend. With him in the car is one of his secretaries, Elizabeth Leighton. And Churchill is still grumpy about having lost power. And so Elizabeth Leighton says something about, well, you know, perhaps it's better to have a rest. You've had such a, demanding time as the war. And it doesn't go down very well. And there's a kind of moody silence as they drive along. And they go, one imagines it, along Lower Thames Street, up to the tower, round the tower, over Tower Bridge, down towards the Old Kent Road and towards Chartwell. And along the way, Churchill sees people clearly relaxing and looking forward to the victory over Japan, which will end the whole business. And Elizabeth Leighton can see there's something welling up inside him, and it eventually he chokes it out. I wanted to do the peace as well. Yalta was not the moment when Europe was divided. That had been decided on the battlefield. Yalta was an effort at the conference table to ameliorate the situation, and Churchill spent the rest of his life trying to do it. He famously said in 1939 that what really drove the actions of Russia is a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. For him, the key to that riddle was Joseph Stalin. We remember Winston Churchill as our greatest war leader. Of course, he was intoxicated by the heat of battle. Yes, he yearned to win the Victoria Cross, and he loved the challenge of planning war on a global scale. But Churchill was not a warmonger. He saw war as a means to an end. I wanted to do the peace as well. Thank you. You're going to be Stalin now?
I am. Yes,
good.
Right. Well, Captain Stephen Roskill, of course, was both a man of action and a man of words, an historian and a naval man. And I think in both capacities, he would have hugely appreciated that lecture. We do have a little bit of time for questions now, about 10 minutes. We should have 2 roving microphones in the audience. So if you've got a question, if you'd like to raise your hand, wait for the microphone to come to you. And if we could ask you to keep your questions relatively brief, and also perhaps to give your names for the record. So gentleman over here, first of all.
Brian Tipping, journalist. If he had done the piece, could you briefly outline what sort of piece we'd have had, please?
I think Churchill was, in many ways, fortunate that he didn't have to. His wife Clementine famously said after the election was announced and she was trying to cheer him up, she said, well, my dear, you've been very tired, it may well be a blessing in disguise. And he said, well, at the moment it is quite effectively disguised. But, if you think about it, what would he have had on his plate? It would have been a whole set of issues to do with, for example, India and Palestine, on which Churchill was in the position to attack the Attlee government. It's not clear that he would have been able to do very much that's different. I would imagine that he would have moved towards he was deeply grateful for the development of NATO when it came along. So I don't think that the Churchill peace would have been fundamentally different from what happened. But what Churchill never accepted was that the Cold War was a satisfactory outcome from the Second World War. And that's what I think is part of his deeper emotional feeling about the sense in which he had done so much and yet he had not in some way brought together the three allies into the post-war period as well.
Okay, well, perhaps we'll take a couple of questions in sort of quick succession. So I think Admiral Parry down here, and then Malcolm Dean in the middle down over here.
Thanks very much, and thanks for a great presentation. I noticed that the great leaders are festooned by all their top military commanders at Yalta. So my question is, what are they talking about while they're at Yalta?
Can we take
take
the question down here as well from Malcolm, and then we'll take...
David, part of the Roskill. I'm Malcolm Dean, part of the Roskill tribe. Can you tell us this? The Committee on the Dismemberment of Germany to decide whether Germany should be divided into 6 nations, if that had gone ahead, what might have happened apart from us, England, winning a World Cup?
Yes, I think I might leave it at that, actually, but no, that's not fair. So what did the military discussed military matters, but what was striking, and in terms of the spirit of Yalta, was that when they met at Tehran, every question that in their military discussions had to be referred to Stalin. So, you would say, just a fairly normal thing which the British and the Americans would have just chewed over, question would be noted, and then it was taken to Stalin, and you get an answer at the next meeting. At Yalta, it was much more of a free flow. So, for example, they were very impressed with Antonov, who I think was then chief of the Soviet General Staff. You had a business-like talk as military men. And there were also, big breakthroughs. For example, when Stalin said, yes, we're coming into the war against Japan, he gave the green light for them to conduct discussions with the military mission in Moscow and so on. So there was a sense, you were beginning to move towards the kind of relationship that the British and American chiefs of staff have been used to for years. They also discussed, a whole lot of things to do with the planning for the actual surrender and things like that. Of course, one of the things that mattered in the later stages of the war was actually agreeing where the different armies were going to be in Europe, because there were a number of serious friendly fire incidents where, in one particular case, an American air detachment shot up a Soviet convoy, I think on the edge of Hungary. And there was a serious loss of life. So it was important to deal with those sorts of things. But they were essentially more business-like meetings than compared with Tehran. So yes, the question of division, this is an old one that, again, if you think about the idea, events now long in the past or once in the future, if we are talking about the 1940s, Bismarck's Europe is only 70 years old, relatively speaking. Nobody could have remembered a previous time, but it was certainly, they were well aware of it in terms of recent history. So the idea that Germany as a unified country in that form was set in stone was not axiomatic. In any case, what had Germany done since it had become unified? Basically, you know, it was regarded as the root of two world wars. So one of the answers was to say, you cannot have a strong Germany in a peaceful Europe. Let's break it up. And of course, that is the issue that comes back again in 1989, 1990, and on which you have divided opinions. You know, Margaret Thatcher much more concerned about the revival of German power. The French not happy about it, but accepting it if it's within the framework of a European, the European community, and of course the idea of a common European currency so that it will weaken the power of the Deutschmark. In a way, this is an issue that has run, you know, right through the last century or more of European history, and the debates there about German dismemberment are a reflection of that.
Okay, time for just a couple more questions. So we'll go to the lady at the back. Up there, first of all.
This is a question from a non-historian, so I apologise if it's not quite appropriate. But
those are always the most difficult, by the way. So.
You said that it was the war that caused the division of Europe. And I wondered what effect you thought the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact had in 1939 and whether that still coloured Stalin's impressions and also Churchill's impressions. Sorry, my name's Carol Pearson, by the way.
Okay. So while you plunge yourself back to 1939, we'll take a question from Randolph Churchill up here.
Yes, thank you very much, Dave. I would just like to ask about, we've all seen on the news the 75th anniversary of the dreadful suffering of those who were in the concentration camps. Was that discussed at all at Yalta, or was that known about?
So the question of the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, well, of course, this definitely haunted the British. And in the early stages of the relationship with Stalin in 1941-42, when Stalin kind of says, you know, come on, where's the second front? Churchill says, well, we carried on without significant help from you in 1940. Indeed, hint, 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 you were on the other side. Did it affect their thinking about the division of Europe? No, but I think the point, if you like, to slightly amplify what I said, is that about it being decided on the battlefield, the Red Army bears the brunt of the battle against the Wehrmacht. It just about survives in 41, it just about survives in 42, and then it begins the rollback. Stalin is pressing for a second front that will divert the enemy, the Germans, significant parts of the Germans from the Eastern Front. He says to Churchill, you know, we are losing thousands of men. You lose some men to, you know, make a sacrifice that will be significant. And Churchill says to him, I cannot go to the House of Commons and justify the loss of 100,000 men. That is not possible. I'm paraphrasing now. This is not possible for a democratic leader, for Churchill or for Roosevelt, whereas Stalin is prodigal with his use of lives, loss of lives. So that is part of why the second front does not happen in 41, 42 and 43. British and Americans are still mobilizing, but they're not going to do suicide attacks on the continent of Europe. The consequence of that is that if the Red Army survives against the Wehrmacht, then it is going to be in a fundamentally strong position in Eastern Europe. So the counterfactuals would involve things like, well, you're willing to pay a huge price to get a foothold on the continent, British and the Americans, and of course also the crucial premise of D-Day, there is a safe lifeline across the Atlantic for the supplies. And that is not decided until the middle of 1943 when the U-boats are defeated. So that that side of the division of Europe, I think, also matters. I've talked about the eastern side, but we do not, for good reasons, end up on the continent till June 1944. The question about the horror of the camps. Obviously, Auschwitz has just been opened up by, of course, Soviets. The moment when the enormity of what's been happening inside the Third Reich and its empire dawns on public opinion in Britain and in America in a big way is when British armies liberate Bergen-Belsen and American armies liberate Buchenwald. And those are conveyed through two sort of iconic journalists, Richard Dimbleby, for the British, Ed Murrow, I think it was Murrow. Anyway, for the Americans. But of course, at that point, there is still a tendency to say, well, this shows how beastly the Germans have been to everybody. So yes, Jews, but also homosexuals, the mentally ill, Romans, the Gypsies, and so on. It's not understood at that stage as Endlösung, the kind of single-minded attempt to exterminate a race. So there's a dawning dawning sense by the spring of 1945, yes, this is what we fought for, and it was a good war. But it's not been focused, it hadn't been focused in the way it is now, I think, for us to understand the sheer horror of what Hitler's project was all about.
Okay, well, Randolph, I think I must take this opportunity to apologise to you for my caricature of your great-grandfather. Clearly, Gary Oldman's job is safe. All I can say in my defence is that it was entirely David's idea.
Yes, it's my fault. Thank you, Alan. Very sweet of you, yes.
I should also say sorry to all of those people out there who have questions, and there were several of you. You will have your chance to grab David, I'm sure, over a drink. But unfortunately, this is only water, not vodka. So I think now is the moment where we should adjourn for drinks. So can I call upon the Master of Churchill College, Professor Dame Feeney-Donald, to give our vote of thanks.
Well, David, that was a spectacular talk. As Alan said at the beginning, quite a few of our Roskill lectures have touched on the Cold War. I haven't been at any of the previous ones on that subject, and I certainly learnt a huge amount. As master of this college, I think there's a sense that I should be looking to Churchill for how to lead the college. And I must say, when it comes to college council, I am only too glad we don't have to rely on consecutive translation. I think that was an inspired way of indicating some of the challenges that diplomats then, and thankfully less now, had to rely on. So Alan, Olga, Barbara, and Andrew, thank you very much for that enactment. It certainly brought things to life in an important way. It's always lovely to see so many members of the Roskill family here. I believe we have 3 generations tonight, so thank you for continuing to support this lecture. Of course, thank you to the archives team, and I think we probably should thank the maintenance team as well for making sure that we aren't frozen. The archives will come back like the phoenix, even better, but it has been a slightly difficult few weeks. So, as Alan said, you're all very welcome to adjourn to the buttery and the Wolfson foyer, where you can pin down our splendid speaker again and quiz him on all those things you didn't get a chance to ask him. I am sure there are many, many more questions because it was such a fascinating lecture. And those of you who are staying for dinner, it is a Yalta-themed dinner, but I am assured, again, there is no vodka, and I don't think any cigars either. Thank you, David.